Good evening,
Good evening.
ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Radnor Memorial Library. It's so nice to see you all. Here we are in person in the Windsor Room. First time with an author on a typical Wednesday night as we used to do in the past. And I am very happy to see you. And Nick Wardigo is here, a representative from our independent bookseller here in downtown Wayne, Pennsylvania. And that is Main Point Books, so we do have books to sell tonight. And I'd like to thank Radnor Historical Society, my frequent partner for so many events, because we are history lovers here in Radnor Township. And Tom, I want to thank you for recording this event. So let me tell you, my name is Pam Sador. Again, welcome to Radnor Memorial Library. Our guest author this evening is Neil Lanctot, PhD. He is the author of the book we're talking about tonight, The Approaching Storm. He is also a historian who has written 4 books. Tonight we're going to talk about The Approaching Storm. I didn't grab my copy, but the official title is The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and their clash over America's future. Thank you, Nick. It is a beautiful book published by Penguin Random House last October. Lanctot's writing has appeared in the Smithsonian, Chicago Tribune, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Baltimore Sun, and several other journals and anthologies. Again, thank you for coming. It's so nice to see all of you here. And tonight we're talking, Neil is presenting a book that he wrote on the Great War. We have not had many authors. This is the first time I can say that we've had an author of a book about the Great War here in the Windsor Room. So I want to thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you for pronouncing my name right and doing your
Oh,
homework.
yeah.
My name is often mispronounced, so I'm kind of used to telling people in advance. It's actually French-Canadian. So as Pam said, we'll be talking about World War I. It's not one of these wars that most Americans have a great deal of knowledge about, but hopefully by the end of my talk you'll realize how important it was, not just for the United States, but for the 20th century. So I want to start by explaining how I came to write this book. I had been looking through Our Times, and you can see Our Times up there, series of books. It was written by Mark Sullivan. Mark Sullivan was a big shot journalist in the early 20th century. He knew everyone. He knew where all the bodies were buried. And in the 1920s and 1930s, he wrote a series of books about current America, or America for the last 20 years. I happened to pick up this series of books and start looking through it. And I noticed that his books on World War I were extraordinarily interesting, just like fascinating stuff, and stuff that I didn't know much about. I was reading about the rapid changes in the United States and all these larger-than-life political figures, and then the United States' giant and unprecedented leap into European affairs. And after reading all this really great stuff, I could see that there was potential there for a book of some kind. But I wasn't really sure what I should write about at first. I knew that America's involvement in the war was less than 2 years, so that's a problem. I knew also, and as Pam indicated, World War I it just kind of pales in comparison as far as readers in America to World War II and the Civil War. Those are the big, sexy wars, so to speak, as far as readers are concerned. World War I for the United States just doesn't have that kind of drawing power. But I could see that our involvement in this war was unbelievably significant. You have to think of it this way. Without the United States' involvement in World War I, there's possibly no defeat of Germany. And if there's no defeat of Germany, there's no remaking of the map of Europe with the Versailles Treaty, there's no reparations imposed on Germany, there's no rise of Hitler, and you have an entirely changed landscape for the 20th century if we decide to stay out of this war and the war is instead fought to a draw of some kind. So America's decision to go to war in 1917 actually changed the 20th century. And that was really what I was going to decide to focus on. You know, how did we come to make this incredibly important decision? That's going to be my focus for this book. So, I knew I wanted to write about this. The question is, how do you tell this story? I decided the best way, and the way that would probably appeal to most readers, is to do a character-driven approach. I wanted to focus on three well-known individuals who were going to be strongly associated with the progressive movement, which was sweeping the country in the early 1900s, and was still going on at the time the Great War began in 1914 in Europe. I also wanted individuals who were not only progressives, but were also involved very strongly in the key decisions on the way to American involvement in this war. I also wanted them to know one another well, not three random strangers. And finally, I thought it was important that these three individuals all represented a different perspective as to how the United States should respond to the slaughter that's unfolding in Europe in 1914. For me, the choice was pretty obvious. The three most famous progressives in America in 1914 were former President Theodore Roosevelt, you see here, the social worker and reformer Jane Addams, and the current president Woodrow Wilson. Each of these individuals understood immediately how important this war was, but they all are going to differ greatly on what path the country should follow. And what's interesting and particularly fascinating, that all three of them displayed a great deal of political courage. They were willing to make very unpopular decisions at times, even if it hurt their popularity or hurt them politically. In some ways, these three individuals had a great deal in common. They were born within a 4-year period between 1856 and 1860. All of them were very, very smart, brilliant writers, brilliant thinkers. They were all household names in America, if not the world, in 1914. Probably the most famous at the time of the outbreak of war was Roosevelt. Teddy, as they called him, or TR. Roosevelt had been an inescapable force in American politics and culture for years. And he passionately believed that America had an important role to play on the world stage. But in 1914, when the war is breaking out, it's a very frustrating time for Theodore Roosevelt. He's not president anymore, and that enough is killing him. He couldn't stand being out of office, as many presidents can't. It's very difficult for them to be out of office. He also despised the Democrat in the White House, Woodrow Wilson. We'll talk about that in a few moments. That hatred of Wilson is going to only intensify in the coming years until it almost consumes him. I mean, he absolutely despises Woodrow Wilson. It didn't help that Wilson had defeated him in 1912 when Roosevelt tried to run a third party, the Progressive Party, and Wilson finished in first that year and Roosevelt finished in second. For Jane Addams, it was a transitional time for her when the war began. She's not a name we know very well today. She should be better known. She's actually someone who's far ahead of her time. But in the 19-teens, she was one of the most famous women in America. She had made her name working with the urban poor in Chicago at Hull House. Hull House was a settlement house, and she had started Hull House with a friend in 1889. And from there, she got involved in all kinds of reform activities in Chicago and eventually went national. And she was famous by the turn of the century, so much so that the Ladies' Home Journal in the early 1900s called her the foremost living woman in America today. I would say that at the time of World War I, maybe Helen Keller might be a little bit more famous than Jane Addams in the United States, but Jane Addams would probably number two, you flip-flop the two of them. But she was enormously famous, enormously influential. Again, has been forgotten today. In doing this book and promoting this book, that's usually the first question I get from people. Who's this Jane Addams? I never heard of her before. I'm not trying to explain who she is, but hopefully people will gain a little more appreciation from her from this book. She was a big-time liberal. big-time progressive. And she was involved in just about every liberal cause of the day, civil rights, suffrage, and things like that. So it wasn't surprising she got involved in the Progressive Party, this new Progressive Party that Roosevelt set up in 1912. And she even seconded his nomination at the convention in 1912. At the time of the outbreak of war in 1914, she was still involved in the Progressive Party and the suffrage movement, but she's going to move much more consciously into another cause that had always been very important to her, and that's pacifism. Finally, Woodrow Wilson. The onset of this war comes at the worst possible time for him. His wife is dying. She's dying of what they call Bright's disease. Bright's disease was kind of a catch-all term for kidney disease. It's going to absolutely devastate him when she does die in August 1914. I would say almost he has a breakdown. There's a scene in the book where he's walking the streets of New York a few months later with one of his friends, and he says to the friend, "I wish someone would come up and shoot me right now, because I can't bear this terrible pain I'm in right now. But since no one won't kill me, I'll just keep working as I always do, but I really wish someone would take me out of my misery." So he has almost a breakdown. The death of his wife is so traumatic to him. He had been president for roughly a year and a half at this point, and the public was still getting used to this guy. He had jumped from being president of Princeton to governor of New Jersey to president of the United States in a very short time. And it's unheard of. You think of today, someone become president of the university or an academic jumping into the White House. It's pretty surprising. But he had made this powerful leap in Democratic politics. And the irony is that Wilson was most concerned up to this point with domestic stuff. He was never that interested before this war broke out in international affairs. He thought he was going to make his name as president as a progressive reformer and those kinds of things. That's going to be his issue. But now he's thrown into this unprecedented international situation. When the war breaks out, Americans are shocked. They can't believe that in the 20th century, there is this kind of no-holds-barred war between the European powers. People thought we're moving away from this. We're moving away from the brutality of the past. This is a more enlightened era, the progressive era. So a war between the United Kingdom, France, Russia, against Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire in there too. It seemed like something out of the Napoleonic era. And you can see here the alliances and the famous assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The shock wore off after a period of time, especially when it became clear that neither side was going to win quickly. When the war starts, I think both sides thought they'd wrap it up in a couple of months, but it soon becomes clear it's not going to be a short war at all. And it becomes clear to Americans as they're watching this and following this, that the blood of millions of soldiers are going to be shed before this thing ends. The fundamental question then becomes, what does the United States do? I mean, this decision is so important, and these three giants, Addams, Roosevelt, and Wilson, recognize this, and they all have a belief that the country's got to follow a certain path. And they're each going to try to nudge the country in that direction to make sure that their vision prevails. Let's talk about Jane Addams. For Addams, the outbreak of war was catastrophic. It was not only the unbelievable death and destruction that she found so abhorrent, but she also believed with good reason that any kind of war like this is going to roll back reform in the United States and the rest of the world. It's going to destroy and undermine these things that she had worked for the last 10, 15 years. She pretty quickly came to a conclusion that what the United States should do is throw everything on the scale for peace. That's what we should be doing. We should be trying to find a way to get these two sides to stop fighting. Find a way to bring the belligerents to the peace table. She was hoping that the best way could be the United States doing some sort of Congress of Neutrals. The United States, being the major neutral power, would have a conference with other neutral powers, and that would be a ladder to a larger peace conference that would get the two sides talking and hopefully get the war at least stopped temporarily and maybe completely. Addams is going to do everything possible to make this happen over the next few years. She's going to take the leadership of an unprecedented female-run organization called the Women's Peace Party. And along with other women, she's going to journey to Europe and meet with the heads of state of both sides, meaning she's going to go to Germany, France, England, and other belligerent powers. And all of these countries are going to see her and talk to her, and she's going to try to get them to see, is there anything we can do, is there any common ground between the two sides which we could perhaps in the United States exploit to help bring about peace. You can see her here on the ship that took them to Europe in spring of 1915. There's Addams right here with some of the other women who went along on this mission. She's also going to support the peace ship scheme, which was cooked up by the eccentric automobile mogul Henry Ford. Henry Ford was not an educated man, he was a brilliant engineer, but Ford suddenly got in his head that peace was desirable, war was wasteful, and he, in 1915, begins to talk about, I will throw my fortunes for peace. I will support the peace movement. So Addams is going to be involved with Ford for a little while. Ford gets this idea of taking a ship to Europe where a peace congress and a conference of neutrals can be possibly started. So she'll be involved in that effort as well. But as the war rages on, she's going to pay a price for her activism. This is a woman who's been seen as an American saint up to this point. Everyone loved Jane Addams. She was a do-gooder. She did, But once she starts doing things that are seen as a little more controversial, a little more edgy, the attacks start to rain on her. You really start seeing the newspaper, the press, really getting personal, calling her a crack-brained old maid. How dare she stick her nose in foreign policy? This is not a place for women. I mean, it gets really nasty. I think it was shocking to her because, again, she always had the public behind her, thinking very highly of her. But the criticism really begins during the war, is going to continue for a number of years afterwards, that somehow she's not the ideal woman who's doing acceptable social worker activities and now is getting into much heavier, serious issues that are not as acceptable to the American public. Even Roosevelt, who had been her colleague in the Progressive Party, is going to call her a foolish woman. And the pacifists themselves, he's going to call foolish for what they're trying to accomplish. She is not deterred by Roosevelt's attacks. In fact, she's confident that the man in the White House, Woodrow Wilson, seems to see things her way and seems to see things the way of the pacifists. And she's going to meet with Wilson several times. You can see here Addams, after she left the White House, after seeing Wilson at that time. So Wilson knows her influence is important, and he is willing to talk to her about peace and ways to potentially involve the United States in some kind of peace effort. Let's go to Wilson. As I mentioned, foreign affairs were not his thing. It was really not his forte. He's going to have to really get up to snuff once this war starts. His friend and advisor, Colonel House, got very frustrated with Wilson at times. He felt that Wilson sometimes would be more fixated on who was going to be the postmaster general in New York than this war in Europe. So that was something that could be quite annoying to some of his close colleagues. But Wilson did understand early on what the United States' role should be, at least in his eyes. He believed strict neutrality was the answer, and that the United States should maintain what he called self-possession. The country should not behave emotionally. And this is what he immediately pushes when the war begins. And you can see how this is filtering into popular culture, where the Universal Movie Company, is making these little things on the silent films. The millions who enjoy Universal moving pictures are again reminded of President Wilson's plea for strict neutrality. Forget the horrors of war. Don't take sides. Appreciate the glories of peace. Carl Laemmle, who was the head of Universal Pictures. And again, another one. No matter where you were born, you're an American now. President Wilson asked you to be neutral. Remember his request when you are tempted to take sides in a war discussion. So that is sort of the official party line that the Wilson administration is pushing in the early months of World War I. The problem is this is not necessarily based in reality. It's not possible. America is a country of immigrants, and you have many first and second generation immigrants in this country who are naturally going to side with the nations from where they came. You have many, many German Americans in this country at the time who are going to take the side of the Germans. You have Irish immigrants who detest the United Kingdom, and they're going to side with Germany. You then have many people on the East Coast who have very strong ties with the Allies, who will, of course, be very, very strongly in support of their war effort. And then you have a lot of Americans in the Midwest and the South who don't really care one way or the other. That changes, though, early on with the brutal German invasion of Belgium in late summer 1914. When news of that comes over and Americans read about this, there's really a great rejection of the German cause in this particular war, and a great deal of sympathy for Belgium. I recently wrote an op-ed about this very issue for the Chicago Tribune, making a comparison between the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the invasion of Belgium in 1914, how in both cases there was great sympathy by the American people. Both times you have a Democratic president who is faced with very difficult decisions to make, and in both cases you have Americans who want to do as much as they can but are not willing to commit combat troops. So there are some similarities, but you can see the difficulties that, of course, Joe Biden faces today and what Woodrow Wilson faced in 1914. But it's not just that many immigrants and many Americans are going to take sides. There are some practical issues that Wilson is not going to be able to control. American trade and American travel in the middle of a global war. Both sides are going to violate international law. The British are going to blockade Germany, but they're also going to stop legitimate trade from reaching the neutral ports. The idea being, well, if the United States ships something to a neutral port, it can be reshipped to Germany. We can't allow that, so we have the right to intercept it and confiscate it. This becomes a real flashpoint between the United States and Great Britain at the time. So that is, in fact, a violation of international law. The Wilson administration protests this a number of times. And you can see here an article from 1914 about this very issue, U.S. protests seizure of ship by the British. Wilson administration, they send notes, they complain, but the Allies figure out pretty quickly that, well, the Americans are going to stamp their feet and complain, but they're never really going to do anything too tough. They're not going to ever really come down hard on us. They realize that the United States is going to get rich on trade with the Allies, and they don't want to interrupt that. Armament trade is going to be very, very important. The United States is going to be shipping so much to the Allies. The Germans don't need our armaments because they have their own factories, so they don't really need us, but the Allies do, and they're happy to pay for it. And the United States is going to get rich in the process on this armament trade. Now, the German response to the British blockade is going to pose additional problems. In early 1915, the Germans established a war zone around the British Isles. And they made a very clear statement. They said any ship, a warship or a merchant ship, would be subject to attack by German submarines without warning. And this idea of without warning in 1915 was so unheard of. It was barbaric. People couldn't believe it. Now, of course, the ideas of what is allowed and not allowed in war is going to change quite rapidly. But in 1915, it seemed like this is like piracy, having this, not giving them warning first. What that means for us is that American ships can't be guaranteed safety if they venture into this war zone around the British Isles, because the Germans said, with good reason, we can't always tell if it's an American ship or not, and it's possible we may sink an American ship and Americans may be killed. So this possibly might happen. Wilson is very upset by this, very concerned. He feels this is a violation of neutral rights. And he threatened Germany in a way. He said, you will be held to strict accountability, that's the word he uses, if an American vessel or the lives of Americans are lost. But less than a few months later, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania. You can see right here the artist rendering of Lusitania sinking. Lusitania was a British passenger liner. It's not an American ship, it was a British ship. About 1,200 were killed, and about 100 or so were Americans. So this is a serious loss of life involved here. Many Americans, if you ask them, well, how did the United States get involved in World War I, they probably say, the Lusitania. But if that were true, we would have taken 2 more years for us to get involved in this war. So the Lusitania is important in and of itself, but not really the prime mover in getting involved in this war. It was, however, a real crisis for Woodrow Wilson, and it's the first of a number of crises he's going to face in the next 2 years. When Americans learned of the sinking in May 1915, actually now it's almost 107 years ago, it was May 8th or 9th, 1915, there were some Americans who said, we got to go to war. This is impossible, this is unthinkable, this is unacceptable. And Wilson had been trying to avoid this for 6 months, 7 months. What's especially interesting at this time, while this giant crisis is unfolding, he's in the middle of a secret love affair, courtship with this widow he had just met, Edith Galt. So his wife died in August. March, he meets this widow. By May, he's head over heels in love with her. They're exchanging gooey love letters multiple times a day. It's almost unbelievable. I mean, if you read these letters, I mean, they just went back and forth. And the American public had no idea, of course, at this time. This was all hush-hush. And he's almost obsessed with her. There's almost an obsession. I don't think it affected, someone asked me before, do you think it affected his job, performance? I don't think so. I think he could compartmentalize it. But he was totally consumed by this. He had already asked her to marry her. And she, being, the proper lady of 1915, said, oh, no, you barely know me, no. Of course she was going to marry him, and she does in a little while. But she said no at the time, so he was a little upset about that. But so he's wrestling with affairs of the heart in the middle of this giant crisis. And you can see Edith Galt right there in this picture. Everyone's waiting to see what Wilson's going to do. And it's kind of illustrative of this cartoon from the New York Sun. The New York Sun was a Democratic paper. They were very favorable to Woodrow Wilson, so it's a favorable depiction of him in that cartoon. Everyone thought that Wilson's going to show his hand the following week. So the sinking occurred on Friday, and then I think it was Monday afterwards. He came to Philadelphia, of all places. And he had come here to give a talk in front of a group of immigrants or who were newly nationalized. And this had been planned weeks earlier, had nothing to do with the war. So he came to Philly. It was a facility in North Philadelphia where he came to and did this talk. And everyone's waiting. What's he going to say? What's he going to say? And he did the typical, oh, it's good to have you immigrants, you're now part of our country, blah, 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 blah. And then he said something in the midst of the speech. He said, there's such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. And there's such a thing as a nation being so right it does not need to convince others that it is right. And everyone knew what that meant. That meant we're not going to war, and we don't need to go to war. He felt that the American people really wanted 2 things from him. The American people wanted him to be strong and not kind of roll over against these European powers, but they did not want us to be so aggressive that we'd end up in this war. So basically, stand up for our rights, but not get involved in the war. That's what he felt was his role and his desire at this moment. Roosevelt, of course, was absolutely disgusted. It made him hate Wilson even more. He felt, what is this saying to the rest of the world? What does this say about the United States, that we mean nothing? But as much as Wilson tried, and he's going to expend every effort to keep the country out, the possibility of war is always going to be lurking in the background over the next 12 months. And it's going to take 2 more high-profile sinkings. The Arabic is sunk in August 1915, and then the Sussex in March 1916. After the Sussex sinking, Wilson really laid down the law with Germany. And the Germans agreed, we're going to dial back submarine warfare. were not going to attack merchant vessels without advance warning, which of course destroys the entire power of submarines. If you're attacking with warning, then you don't have the element of surprise. But the Germans agreed to do this because they did not want the Americans in this war. So that minimized the friction with Germany and the United States once the Germans agreed to make this concession in early 1916, that we're not going to fire without warning, and we're going to provide for the safety of those on board. We'll let them get off the ship, we'll then sink the ship. Roosevelt, as I said, was very, very disturbed by this. In his letters at the time, he wrote many times that this is the worst president we've ever had. He's horrible. He's awful. He's a disaster. He's incompetent. And those were some of the nicer things he said about him. I mean, he's a very partisan, people think today's partisan is just as partisan in 1915, 1916. It's funny that these guys had once gotten along. They had once been cordial, at least. I'm not going to say they were ever buddy-buddy, but they were friendly enough. When Roosevelt was president, he had invited Wilson to the White House, and they had a nice little chit-chat. But they came to despise one another. And it was absolutely killing Roosevelt that he's not president at this time. This is like the biggest crisis in the last 100 years, and he's not president. It's just, and a guy he can't stand is president. And you see the cartoon kind of making fun of TR. U.S. should go to war, TR. And again, another one here, hooray for war, down with peace. I mean, he was always a great subject for the political cartoonist at this time and even before then. It's a difficult time for Roosevelt also because of his health. He had picked up a really bad fever in his Brazilian expedition a few years earlier. This progressive party he had set up in 1912 was falling apart. He was being sued for libel in New York. And he felt that the people weren't listening to him anymore, and that in itself was very hard for him. That they just don't want to listen to him, and they seem to think of things in a very different way than he thought of things. In fact, the most popular song of the day was "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier," so I need to play here. And that in itself was a song that he hated with a passion. A little low. Oh.
Good, thanks. There you go.
So that was a giant hit in 1915. And as I said, Roosevelt, he said that song is like telling a woman that I didn't raise my daughter to be a mother. I mean, it's terrible. It's a disgrace. It's awful. So he just felt he was like out of touch with the country, that they would like a man like Woodrow Wilson, that they would like a song like that. He couldn't understand what was happening. He felt that Wilson had really made a number of serious mistakes. Number one, he felt that the United States and Wilson should have protested the invasion of Belgium in 1914. And that the other thing we should be doing is building up our defenses. The United States had a pathetic military apparatus in 1914, 1915. We had like a 100,000-man army, very, very small. And Roosevelt said, we need to prepare, if not for this war, but the next war. In fact, Roosevelt was already saying that if the Germans win this war, I can see them teaming up with Japan in the future. So he was already seeing ahead what might be coming, and he felt that the United States was not prepared. In fact, he said at the time, I've never seen a wealthy country like ours does the least to protect that wealth. And we have a very, very minimal army. Our Navy's not bad, but our army is far too small. So he starts getting behind this issue of preparedness. Preparedness is something he starts talking up constantly in 1915 and 1916. And again, you see this filtering into popular culture. There's this movie in 1915 called The Battle Cry of Peace. It's a silent film. It's basically a 2-hour preparedness propaganda film. Unfortunately, the film has been lost. I wish it was. I'd love to see it. But it really made a splash at the time, and Roosevelt was involved in it, and the guy who financed it lived next to Roosevelt in Oyster Bay. So you kind of get the sense of the film. They never actually called them Germans, but you can tell who the baddies are supposed to be, what's both sides are supposed to represent. Roosevelt believed, and this is very important to him, we as a country cannot act against international wrongdoers unless we have the power to back up our words. And we don't have the power to back up our words. Words mean nothing without some sort of military to back it up. And right now we don't have anything. And Wilson at this point was not embracing preparedness yet. And a lot of Americans didn't want it either. They were afraid of militarism. They thought that was just that's not what our country's all about. There's some people at the time who thought the Boy Scouts were too militaristic. They were concerned about that. That's how our country was looking at the time. Roosevelt and his followers were hoping he could run against Wilson in 1916 again. It was going to be a very tall order if he could pull it off. He's got to get the Republicans to nominate him again. Remember, he had left the Republican Party in 1912 to start this new party up. So a lot of Republicans hate him. He ruined them. He ruined the party in 1912. We lost the election in 1912 because they split the party apart. So they don't want him. Roosevelt does get nominated in 1916 by the Progressive Party, what's left of it. There was really not much left of it. But the conservatives in the Republican Party say, we're not going to nominate Roosevelt. There's no way. He's not getting the nomination. And instead, they turn to Charles Evans Hughes. You can see Hughes in this cartoon right there. Hughes was a former governor of New York. It had been on the Supreme Court. And if you're thinking about Hughes, he later went back to the Supreme Court in the 1930s. 1920s, 1930s. Roosevelt had a really difficult decision to make. Do I run again as a third-party candidate? Which probably means that Wilson will win again. And I hate Woodrow Wilson. I don't want him to win again. My other choice is I support Hughes. Of course, if I do that, that will destroy the Progressive Party. And Roosevelt decided I got to support Hughes because I hate Wilson so much, and Wilson is such a disaster for this country that I have to do it. Even if the Progressive Party falls apart, so be it. There's not much left of it anyway. So he's going to go out on the stump for Hughes in the 1916 election. You can see a little campaign literature here, and you see this cartoon of Hughes and Roosevelt. Whatever Wilson does is wrong. Again, New York World, which, as I said, was a very democratic paper in their orientation. So this election is going to be Wilson against Hughes. Democrats presented Wilson as the man who kept us out of war. We're not at war yet. Roosevelt tried to counter that by saying, well, Woodrow Wilson has deployed troops all over the world. He has sent troops to Mexico. He has sent troops to the Dominican Republic. He has sent troops to Haiti. So he has not kept us out of war. Maybe the big war, but he's not kept us out of war. The Democrats said, you can't vote for Hughes. Teddy's in the background, and Teddy's a warmonger. Can't vote for him. Addams, this is going to be the first election she could vote in. Illinois had recently passed suffrage. So in 1916, there were 12 states that had suffrage. Illinois was one of them. So it's going to be her first presidential election. She's going to vote for Wilson. Wilson had met with her. Wilson seemed to see things her way. She's a little frustrated Wilson hadn't acted for peace yet, but she figured he's a much better bet than the Republicans and Hughes. This was one of the closest elections in American history. Now, we've lived through some close elections lately, we all know. This one was extraordinarily close. It basically flipped over maybe 1,300 votes in California. If 1,300 voters in California had switched their votes from Wilson to Hughes, Hughes wins the election and becomes president. So it was that close. It was an election they did not know the outcome till I think Thursday or Friday. So it was Tuesday's the election, of course, and I think Thursday or Friday they finally were able to call it for Hughes. Germans were watching the election very closely. They were winning the war, but they knew they could not win a long war. It's impossible. They're going to get worn down. They just don't have the resources. They're going to lose a long war. So what they wanted right now in the fall of 1916, they wanted the Americans to bring the two sides together so they could hash out an agreement. An agreement that will ideally be favorable to the Germans because they're winning the war and they want to keep what they've gained up to this point. But that's what they were hoping for. They don't want American mediation. They don't want Woodrow Wilson calling the shots, making decisions on the peace process. They just want him to be bring the two sides together and they get lost. That's basically what they want him to do. The Germans had decided that if no peace conference of this kind materialized in the next few months, we're going to have to go back to the full power of our submarine warfare. All the restrictions we've put in place are going to disappear. And that's a good chance that that's going to lead to war with the United States. So they could see this was going to happen. Wilson understood it. After the election was over, he started working on some kind of outreach for peace, and it was announced in December of 1916. The pacifists and Addams were delighted. They felt we had been waiting for Wilson to do this. He's finally doing it. He's making a move for peace. Unfortunately, it didn't accomplish anything. The Allies were very unhappy with Wilson that he did this. They felt, why does he just mind his own business? The Germans had even thrown out their own little peace effort, which didn't get anywhere either. The problem by the end of 1916 is that both sides still believed they could win. No matter how many men, they lost so much blood and treasure, but they felt they couldn't stop now. You know, we wasted so much that for us to stop now without winning is unacceptable. We have to keep going. So that was where the mindset of both sides were in early 1916. You can see the reaction to this note. Roosevelt called the note immoral. You see the German perspective on these peace efforts with all the countries that they were in control of at this time. And then you see this is the letter that Jane Addams wrote. Well, it's actually a night letter or a telegram was sent to Wilson after he did his peace effort in December 1916. When 1917 begins, the European war had been going on for 2.5 years. Wilson's peace effort, even though it failed, gave people hope. Addams thought this is the beginning of the end. The war is going to end this year. And she felt it's not just about nonviolence, it's about finding modern ways to end disputes in the 20th century. You know, there's got to be better ways. We don't want to lay down any terms, she said, but we just want to see if the countries can find something that they can talk about. So at least to take a break from the fighting, and maybe if they take a break, they'll start talking and they can work something out to end this slaughter. Wilson seemed to share her views. In early 1917, he made a shocking speech before the Senate. He said, the United States should not only participate in a future League of Nations, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, but also become involved in determining and maintaining the peace of this war. And it should be what he called a peace without victory. Again, you had antagonism from the Allies about this, and you can see this editorial here. You know, this London editorial saying, you know, Wilson saying peace without victory, no bitterness. Well, how would the Americans have felt if we had said that to you with the Spanish-American War, that there should be no peace, there should be peace without victory and peace without no bitterness and things like that. The pacifists and Jane Addams were very excited by this. They felt this is what we've been waiting for. Our president is moving to peace, towards peace decisively. We've been waiting for him for 2 years, and now he's moving forward. Unfortunately, that happiness proved to be very short-lived. The Germans had already secretly decided that time was running out. We've got to go for broke in 1917 to win this war. So they decided that as of February 1917, we're bringing back the unrestricted submarine warfare, and we're not going to spare neutral shipping, we're not going to pacify the Americans this time. Wilson is now faced with some really tough decisions, and he had dreaded to make these decisions for years. But the first decision he has to make is to sever diplomatic ties with Germany. And he knows that when you do that, that usually leads to war. Addams went to see him in early 1917, trying to get him to find a peaceful solution. But she sensed that he didn't seem to really share her views. And she almost has a realization that maybe this guy wasn't as much of a pacifist as I thought he was. When they met in February 1917, Wilson had already learned about the famous Zimmerman telegram. And the Zimmerman telegram was this crazy, cockamamie German communication with Mexico proposing an alliance in the event of war. And even pushing the Mexicans to declare war on the United States. And the Germans dangled this carrot in front of the Mexicans saying, yeah, you'll even have a chance to reclaim territory that was taken from you in the Mexican War, places like Texas and Arizona and things like that. It was crazy. It was an absolutely nuts idea. I think no one in the German Foreign Office was really thinking clearly at this time. There was sort of hope that, well, if we get the Mexicans involved, the Mexicans maybe can at least tie up American forces on the border, and that will prevent them from being deployed in Europe. And maybe the Mexicans can act as a ladder to the Japanese, and we get the Japanese on our side. It was a pie-in-the-sky scheme. It blew up in their face. When the Wilson administration got a hold of it, they disclosed it to the public, and you can see the backlash in these various headlines from the time. It didn't stampede the country into war. A lot of people tend to think Zimmerman telegram, that's what put America in World War I. It really didn't, but it did upset people temporarily. It made Wilson feel, I cannot trust the Germans. If I ever could trust them, I surely can't trust them right now. And I think people could see that war was probably not going to be avoidable at this point. For Roosevelt, this is exciting. This is the moment he's been waiting for. He's been waiting for Wilson to take us into war. And for Roosevelt, this would be redemption for him. And he had been hoping that he would get to go over and fight. He'd been organizing this division for about a year or two, a volunteer division, kind of like the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. That he was going to go over to France and fight in this Roosevelt division. This would be a perfect finish for his career. He even said, what better thing would be for me to die for my country? That would be a great way to end my career. I think he was hoping that was going to happen. But Wilson still hesitated in the spring of 1917. He did not pull the trigger yet. It was very frustrating for Roosevelt. You can see in his letters that he's like, why doesn't he do something? What's wrong with this guy? He's never going to take us into war. Addams and the pacifist crowd thought maybe they could reach Wilson at this point. Maybe there's one last chance we can get him to stop this movement into war. It's very hard for Jane Addams because she sees a lot of pacifists jumping ship at this moment, who decide, well, we're going to follow what the government says. We're not going to talk of peace anymore, even though we're not in the war yet. And she's going to find herself already on the outs with much of America. And that's going to continue for 5, 10, 15 years, where she's this woman who's been so venerated and so respected will be seen as a dangerous figure who's not loyal and is practically a German sympathizer. Addams thought maybe there's a chance Wilson will resist pressure, and he'll keep America out while finding a way to bring peace to the belligerents. But Wilson no longer even pretended to see things her way anymore. And when they met in early 1917, they had a very interesting conversation. She's trying to convince him, there's got to be another way. And Wilson pretty much told her, we've got to be involved, because if we're not involved, I would be lucky to get into the peace conference when it occurs through a crack in the door. And that's not acceptable to me. I think Wilson already had this vision, it was his destiny to be involved in the peace process, to be involved in the remaking of the post-war world. And this had to happen, and the way to make it happen was going to be through American involvement. Because if we're not involved in this war, how can the United States have anything to say about peace at all? Following the sinking of 3 American ships in March, Wilson finally made the decision that he had been fearing for years. On April 2nd, 1917, he went before Congress, asked for a declaration of war. He said, America will not fight for material gains or profit, but for the principles of peace and justice against selfish and autocratic power. You can see Wilson here making that speech. And he presented Germany as this major threat that had to be quelled. You know, he made his famous phrase, the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. Speech was a smash. Everyone went crazy over the speech. Addams was disgusted, disillusioned. She really thought, again, as they were simpatico, she just could not see that war was ever the right choice. She felt it was the worst possible option for him to choose at this time. I don't think there's any doubt that if Wilson had wanted to, he could have refrained from going to war in 1970. I think the people would have stood it. There were, as it were, there were many Americans who were, okay, let's say 150, 200 Americans have died in these sinkings. Is that enough to throw us into the bloodiest war in human history? Is this our fight? Is this our concern? Do we need to be involved in this war? So Wilson had it in his power to avoid war if he wanted to, but I don't think he wanted to at this point, and this was disillusioning to Addams and other pacifists. There's also a line of thinking that some people have said that if the United States had stayed out of this war, there's a chance that I think I alluded to this earlier, that neither side can get the upper hand, the war is fought to a draw, and maybe you have, again, an entirely different scenario evolves in Europe in the 1920s where you don't have the rise of fascism. There were some individuals who believe that might even lead to a more democratic Germany if they had been thwarted in this war. But we don't know that. We have no idea. It's all speculation as far as what if might have happened. Roosevelt, as I said, was absolutely delighted. You can see Roosevelt, this is right before the war was declared. After the war was declared, he shows up at the White House for a very potentially uncomfortable meeting with Wilson. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to have watched this discussion between these two men. But it was a nice chat. For what everyone, those who were there, said they had a very pleasant little chat. Roosevelt gave his pitch for, I've got this division, I've got 25,000 men or whatever he had. We're ready to go over. We'll make your words into deeds, and just let me go over, and that's it. And not only that, if I go over, I'll be in the military, and I can't criticize you anymore. That's kind of the other perk. And once he's in the military, he can be stopped from being able to constantly attack him. After the meeting, Roosevelt was optimistic, cautiously, that Wilson would let him go. But ultimately, Wilson was like, no, he's not going. It wouldn't have made any sense for Wilson to let him go, but there were practical reasons. The Army didn't want Roosevelt over there. Do you want an ex-president over there trying to throw his weight around as a former commander-in-chief, offering his 2 cents on every decision, large and small, number one? Number two, Roosevelt didn't have much experience. He did his little Rough Rider thing in 1898. Some people felt he didn't really done that great a job. He'd been a little bit rash. His health wasn't great either. His health was poor. So all these factors were swirling around. And then also there's a sense of, there was already talk that Roosevelt and Wilson might run against each other in 1920, that Wilson might break the two-term tradition and run for a third term. If I'm Woodrow Wilson, do I let my great rival go serve and possibly come back a war hero again, like he did in 1898, which put him in the White House? So there were all these factors that were preventing Roosevelt from going. So Wilson said, no, you're not going. Roosevelt, of course, very, very upset, and he had to watch his 4 sons go over. One of them was killed in the Russian War. So that's basically, again, in a nutshell, a 500-page book distilled into 15 slides. So you get the gist of it. I'll talk now briefly about some of the secondary characters in this book, because the book focuses on those 3, but there's a lot of other individuals who are interwoven in the narrative. Here you have the new First Lady, Edith Wilson, who we alluded to. She becomes a real force in the administration very, very quickly. This is a woman who doesn't have a lot of formal education, but she soon really gets involved with things. I think she manipulates Wilson a little bit. She barely knows Wilson maybe less than 4 or 5 months, and Wilson's already showing her all kinds of state secrets, and she's putting her stamp on it. She's commenting on his speeches. She becomes a really, really powerful figure, and I think, as I said, I think she really liked that a lot. Maybe she was in love with Woodrow Wilson, but I think she was in love with being close to the seat of power. I think that was very important. And in fact, she started to, I think, intentionally drive a wedge between Wilson and his friend and advisor, Colonel House, who House had this very strange relationship I don't think I've ever seen before, of a guy who was so close to the president but had no official title. He was simply his advisor. But Wilson respected him and went to him far more than he did his cabinet. Wilson thought his cabinet were a bunch of incompetents. He thought his diplomats were no good either. Colonel House was someone he really trusted. And House was allowed to go to Europe during the war and try to make peace and to broker peace. And supposedly, speaking for Woodrow Wilson, but at times, many times, House went beyond what Wilson wanted him to do and went far beyond his instructions. And I think got very intoxicated with his role. And eventually Wilson will cut him off, but that's late during Versailles in 1919. Why House is important in particular is that he kept a diary. Every night he would go back and he would dictate his diary. And so that provides some of the best source for the Wilson administration. The problem is it's all told through House's viewpoint, which means everything House does is brilliant and everything everyone else does is not. So you have to kind of use his material very cautiously, particularly his views of Wilson, because as you read his diary, he starts getting in little digs about the president doesn't like people, the president doesn't do this, it's important. I mean, he starts getting in all these little insults against the man he supposedly is serving. So I think his ego really grows exponentially. On the right here, you have the ambassador to the United States from Germany, Johann von Bernstorff. He's a guy who, unlike most of the folks back in Berlin, understood how important the United States was. He understood America very well. He had married an American himself. And he does superhuman efforts to try to keep the United States out of this war. So I think he understood more than ever what was going on here. Interesting about Bernstorff, he was carrying on an affair with an American woman at the time. In fact, several members of the German embassy were having affairs with American women. How do we know this? Well, the Wilson administration was doing wiretaps at the time, so all this stuff came up. Very surprising, because I didn't know wiretaps were even feasible at that time, but they were. And you can actually read the transcripts of these little, these tete-a-tetes, shall we say, going on between these German figures in the embassy and American women. Three more secondary characters I'll touch on. This is Rosika Schwimmer, who was a Hungarian pacifist. She came to the United States and really, I think, lit a fire under the pacifist movement. She worked very closely with Jane Addams. And she succeeds in getting money for the pacifist movement from Henry Ford. Ford is a figure who also is interwoven in this book. Ford is a rock star in America in 1914, 1915. I mean, he's got the Model T Ford. Everyone loves the Model T. He's paying his workers $5 a day. People can't believe that. $5 a day was unthinkable. So everyone thinks that Henry Ford's a genius. He's a genius in cars. He must be a genius in everything else. So when he starts throwing his 2 cents into peace and international affairs, people listen to him. Some people listen to him. Roosevelt's very frustrated with him. He says, all he knows about is motors. He doesn't know anything about anything else. But the American people listen to him. So that was TR's view of Henry Ford. And finally, the last secondary character I'll touch on here is James Norman Hall. I used him as an example of an American who went over to serve in the war on the Allied side before we were actually involved in the war. And right now with the Ukraine situation, there was the first American who was killed recently who went over to serve. So you had a good number of Americans who went over to serve, sometimes through Canada. James Norman Hall was in London at the time the war began, and he basically, when he enlisted, they knew he was an American, but the British just said, oh, just protect the British if they ask you. So they let him in. And he left behind a number of really fascinating letters of his experiences serving in the British Army. He also served in the French Air Corps and also the American Armed Forces. Some of you may be aware he later became a famous novelist. He's best known for writing Mutiny on the Bounty. So that's really what James Norman Hall is known for.
Yes.
Finally, I'll talk now briefly about writing and researching this book. I always say writing a book like this is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, except you have 500 times the pieces that you need to make the puzzle. There's so much information. I started by reading the secondary literature on these individuals, but there's so much. My primary research focus was the original sources, the primary sources. And this was a time when people wrote a ton of letters. I mean, telephones existed, of course, in 1914, 15, 16, 17, but a lot of the business of American life was still being done through correspondence. In fact, some communities, I think New York City had like 5 or 6 mail deliveries a day. You could send a letter those days, and sometimes it would even be received in the same day in some communities. So mail was so important. For as far as research is concerned, that means there's just an enormous amount of correspondence to go through. You can see here, these are all just samples of their letters. This is Jane Addams. Jane Addams' handwriting was atrocious. Luckily, she typed this one, but it really drove me bonkers trying to read her handwriting. Roosevelt's handwriting was better. A lot of his stuff was typed, and Wilson too. A lot of individuals, well-known individuals like these three who had active correspondence, they had stenographers. That's a word we don't hear about much today, but maybe some of you know what a stenographer is.
Oh, yeah.
Old-time expression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you used to have stenographers, and that was a good job in those days, nice job for women, who would, they take the dictation and they type it up. So that's who they would employ to do these many letters. I also made extensive use of the daily newspapers, which are absolutely fascinating. I mean, they're very revealing. Most cities had multiple newspapers in those days. So Philadelphia in 1914, 15, I think there were 5 or 6. New York probably had 10 or 12. And they were all differentiated by their political orientation. So Philadelphia would have 2 Democratic newspapers and 3 Republicans and maybe independent. Same thing in New York. So you could read the newspapers and get a different slant. And often when you read multiple newspapers, you could kind of piece together a particular episode. Like, for example, when Wilson got married in 1915 to Edith Wilson, to Edith Galt. If you read the 4 Washington newspapers, you can get a little something different from each one of them to kind of put it all together to get a sense of what exactly happened. And I use the newspapers also to illustrate American life at the time. That's a big part of this book as well. America, the world of America in 1915, 1916, it's not just about the war, it's about the world of that time. So I integrated particular events that were unfolding. The polio epidemic of 1916 was right in the middle of this. And this affected all of our principal characters. Wilson's daughter was very worried about that. They moved the family away, and a little girl away from the polio epidemic. There was an outbreak in Oyster Bay where TR lived. So these major episodes were also integrated, but also the way to provide a snapshot of American life at this time. So after doing 2 or 3 years of research, then it's time to write, which is not the fun part, it's the unfun part. Writing is a very time-consuming and very, trying to synthesize vast amounts of material into a narrative is not easy. This book is, I think it's 570 pages. As I said, it was a big book. I didn't necessarily intend it to be that long, that's just how it turned out to be. But when I was writing, I tried to set a goal for myself every day. I would try to write like 1,000 words a day. That would be my goal. And then slowly chip away at this monster. It takes you I mean, the book, start to finish, I think I got the contract in 2015, wrapped it up about 2020. It's about 5 years writing and researching this book. So it's a very time-consuming process. As I said, I think writers like writing when they can look at the book and see that book all completed, but before you get to that point, it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So I'm going to stop here and take some questions if anyone has any questions. I know I've been talking for a while, so maybe you have something you'd like to ask or something you'd like to comment on.
Thank you, Neil.
Yes?
So, was the Lusitania carrying weapons?
There were munitions on the Lusitania, and that was one of the Germans' excuses that there were some on the Lusitania.
And how did they determine that? Is that based on the wreckage, or is that based on how it
I think on the
came apart and
manifest, the ship
exploded?
manifest, they were carrying cartridges, I think gunpowder, things like that. It was not the primary purpose, but there were some on there. So the Germans did try to use that as a sort of a, well, there was material on there. They also tried to claim there was Canadian soldiers on there, which we do know now that was not true, but there were munitions on there. I didn't mention William Jennings Bryan, who was the Secretary of State. Bryan felt that was a big loophole, that was a big problem. Bryan felt, there were munitions, and we should not be shipping our munitions to the Allies, because then they're going to get shot at by German submarines and we're going to get involved in the war, so we should stop we should try to prevent this from going on. And eventually Brian will resign over this issue. Yes?
I think we can all kind of understand, Woodrow Wilson's the sitting president of the United States, we understand that. A former president who seemed like they loved being president would like to return. We've had several of those in the last generation or so.
We always have several, don't we?
What or who might Jane Addams remind us of in the modern day?
Has to be someone I think who would be a staunch liberal. I think Elizabeth Warren wouldn't be a bad match for Jane Addams. Addams actually, Roosevelt had said that if Roosevelt said if he'd been elected president in 1912, he was going to put Jane Addams in the cabinet. And she would have been the first woman in the cabinet before Frances Perkins, who was put in there in with FDR in the 30s. So I think Jane Addams could have gone political in another world. I mean, some people called her a lady politician, which was not a nice thing to call her. They felt that she was too invested. In fact, when she got involved in politics, there were a lot of attacks on her because they felt this was not appropriate for a woman. She's supposed to be a social worker, a do-gooder, not get involved in partisan politics. But I do think someone like Elizabeth Warren, who I think is involved in many liberal causes and somewhat the voice of, quote unquote, the progressives of today, at least at the Senate level. You can throw AOC out there, but I really think Elizabeth Warren's a little more weighty, this is my own personal opinion, than AOC is. I think she would be a better match for Jane Addams.
To what extent did the Bolshevik Revolution weigh on the decision to go to war with the elimination of the Eastern Front, but also the ideology and the appeal to the masses in the trenches to turn their bayonets on their officers, since the message was they had more in common with each other than they did with those sending them to war to fight each other.
You mean the United States decision?
Yeah.
I don't think it had a huge amount of influence. I do know when it was happening, there was some back and forth with Wilson saying, well, we need to support the revolution. And this is this great thing that's occurring for democracy, so the United States getting involved in this war would be an assistance to this. Whether it made Roosevelt any more or less, Wilson any more or less interested in going to war, I don't think so. I think Wilson had made this decision before even the revolution, and I think it came down to what I believe, that his belief that he had to be involved in this war, that to remake the peace and to remake the world and the League of Nations, we have to be involved in this war. So I think it had some influence, but maybe not a substantial amount. Go ahead, you were.
The Roosevelt letter in the middle there to Kermit, what's the gist there, the subject matter? I'm just curious what he had to say to Kermit.
Let's see, Mother has returned in your letter written about the time of your telegram, saying that Bell's Kermit's wife, had bronchitis, but it arrived. I was very glad to see you got the letter. We got the letter. Darling Bell, this is like a personal letter.
Okay.
It was dreadful, and it's a personal letter to his son about. I think, if I recall correctly, I think Bell may have been pregnant at the time, and I think she might have had, I can't remember what disease she had, typhoid, I believe. I think she had typhoid. And I think she was coming back home, and I think that's what the letter was all about. But as I said, Roosevelt wrote so many letters. I mean, so many letters. And he got all kinds of crazy requests from people. Can you lend me money? Can you get my book published? It's because he was a figure. He was a celebrity. He was not just a politician.
Right.
He was someone who people recognized to such a degree on many levels, and I think people would go to him. Even years after he got out of the White House, he still commanded a great deal of personal power. Wilson never had that kind of idolatry, because I think Wilson was not as personable a figure, although Wilson could be more friendly than people gave him credit for. A lot of people thought Wilson was a cold fish. He was an academic, but he actually was quite lively around people he knew. He told a lot of jokes. He liked to, like limericks. One thing we haven't mentioned, and I'll mention it real quick at a time, we're probably running out, but Wilson has become a very controversial figure in the last 5-10 years. I mean, he has, the racial issue has I think, really harmed Woodrow Wilson's reputation. People have tended to, I think they've gone too far. This is my own perspective. I feel like Wilson has become now history's greatest monster, which is not fair. Certainly his racial views were abhorrent. He certainly did enforce segregation in the government, but he also did some positive things as well. So I hate to see all of his contributions be thrown out. But as you probably are aware, Princeton University took Wilson's name off their school.
Right.
You're seeing that happen in other. I think in Camden there was a school that was Woodrow Wilson High School or something that took his name off it.
But I think initially, didn't Princeton say, no, we're not going to do
Well,
that?
they gave it.
But in the end, they did.
They did give it. Yeah, I think the way Woodrow Wilson's contribution off the map, I think is wrong. As I said, of the three in this book, the only one who was really ahead of her time was Jane Addams, as far as race was concerned. Addams was truly pro-civil rights, was involved in setting up the NAACP. Roosevelt was better than Wilson, but not great. But I think the average American in 1915, 1916, most of them, their views would be considered to be very offensive and unacceptable in the 20th century. So I think with Woodrow Wilson, as I've tried to say when people have asked me this, he grew up in the South. He couldn't get away from those views. I mean, he was raised to believe certain things. His family had slaves. So he never could conceive of African Americans being much more than that. So I think that was the basis of his issues. And then his cabinet was full of Southerners. He put a bunch of Southerners in there who enforced segregation in their departments, and Wilson didn't do anything to stop it. There's a scene in the book where William Monroe Trotter, who was an African-American editor, came to see Wilson at the White House about this issue. And again, you have a stenographer who was there to capture the whole back and forth. It goes on for like 10 pages. It's very interesting. And Trotter's trying to explain to Wilson, it's like segregation, can you understand this? This makes it seem like we are not equal to you, that we're not brothers, by segregating us. And Wilson he can't seem to understand it. He says, like, well, we're just trying to avoid friction. I don't understand why you can't see this. We're just, if you see this as offensive, well, you're not understanding. We're just trying to, my colleagues and I are trying to eliminate friction in the government departments. This is not meant as a humiliation. And Trotter just keeps trying to explain to him over and over, what segregation means and why it's damaging. And Wilson can't quite get it. And eventually, the Secret Service people come and kind of haul Trotter away, or you talk to the president enough, and he's getting upset. So bye. So Wilson could be very closed-minded. He was very closed-minded when it came to women's suffrage. I mean, the suffragists were quite unhappy with Woodrow Wilson. That he was very slow to jump on the suffrage train. Roosevelt was ahead in that regard. Wilson does eventually come out for it, but it takes him a while. And I think Wilson's view of women was very much traditional, Southern gentleman kind of view. And I think that's why he liked his wife, his second wife, who was very much, she idealized her husband. He did not like lady politicians. He didn't have much of a place for them. So I do, as I said, I do think Wilson has probably, I think the pendulum has swung too far. At one point, Wilson was highly regarded as one of our great presidents. Now he's regarded like one of our worst presidents. I don't think that's correct either. Yes?
Time for one more. Go ahead.
At that time, wasn't like Kaiser Wilhelm and the Tsar and the King of England, weren't they all Victoria's kids? Queen Victoria?
They're all related. I can't remember the exact relationships off the top of my head, but yes, they're all related. They're cousins.
Victoria.
Yeah, I can't remember who's who. There's a scene in the book where the American diplomat to Germany goes to talk to the Kaiser, and he's very haughty with him. He says something like, "I and my cousins will decide when peace comes." That's exactly what he said. So, and it's almost like these monarchs were so out of touch with the world, and they just kind of still saw themselves as almost gods. And we'll decide when we'll fight till it's over, and then we'll decide. And the rest of you just stay away, stand back. So.
Okay. Thank you, Neil. And Neil will be signing books.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Radnor Historical Society and Main Point Books. Thank you so much.